So who am I? I am Aaron Blue. I live in Portland, Oregon. We get to pick alternate titles of validation, so I picked the automator when I joined 5 years ago. And that's been kind of my mission ever since I started there, just to automate as much as possible and make things consistent and repeatable. And I've been at a few different places. Was at Musicians Print and then Guitar Center, doing e-commerce and warehouse Unix support at a company called Chalkstone that was acquired by Heartland Payment Systems very shortly before their breach. So that was exciting to learn about after we got acquired. We're like, oh, okay, who are these guys? Why do we want this? And now at Validation, I've been there for about 5 years now. And we do fraud mitigation through device reputation. So if you're a bank or a dating site, you can integrate us and you can assess, the visitors or people logging into your site and use us to prevent an account takeover and other kinds of attacks like that. My group does, we manage all the production systems. We work all the DevOps group, but that's really kind of an innocuous term. Everyone in your IT organization helps do things in a DevOps kind of way. So we changed our names to Service Reliability Engineering. So we're here to talk about how we assess risk with changes that we're going to make in our environment. And so we had an older methodology that was pretty good at catching issues with larger sets of change. We'd go and make a large database configuration change, or we go and do a large code deployment. And because of our system architecture, we'd be in at 5 in the morning doing the work and testing the work and then going, oh man, I guess I missed a step because it's 5 in the morning and we're not quite awake yet. Things along those lines. And so those kind of things were kind of painful. So, one of the things that we did was we would do dry runs before we went to production. So someone in QA takes their machine that they've been testing on, uninstalls the new version, reinstalls the old version, say, okay, this is how we think it is in production. Then we go and install the new stuff again according to the documentation that's been produced. And then, we spend a bunch of time doing that. We're not always 100% confident that we have the whole environment as it is in production, because there are, tens of machines in some cases, dozens of machines. So it doesn't always work well. Sometimes we had go, no-go meetings. We weren't consistent about it. They had varying levels of quality depending on who was driving them, how big the scope of the change was, things like that. And one of the things that we did that had some good results was a thing we called the ICL. And it came out of some folks that used to work at Intel. And in Intel's big fab plants, they have huge risk-averse, mindsets, because when the fab's down, they stop making money to the tunes of millions of dollars an hour or whatever their scale is. So that we built these large spreadsheets. These are the more updated versions. They used to be Excel spreadsheets on a Windows share that only one person could edit at a time. It was really laborious, and you'd have 2 or 3 meetings before a big event, all sitting down and planning each step for each part of the process. Pre-downtime work, long lead items before that, and so on and so forth. Take a long time. Google Docs made this a lot better, but a spreadsheet is not a great way to track a lot of the stuff, especially when it comes to reporting on it later and things like that. So like I said, the spreadsheet was a pain. We didn't have a lot of accountability for lower risk projects. The smaller changes that seemed innocuous sometimes ballooned into like, oh wow, yeah, that affected all outbound mail, and now customers aren't getting reports, or other things along those lines. And there was no feedback loop. People would go and they'd make their changes, and sometimes it went well, and that seemed well enough, and why would you continue to talk about it after it was done? But then other times it went badly, and we still wouldn't talk about it because we're putting out fires on our heads or whatever else. So trying to figure out where to go from here. We really wanted to maintain our velocity. We were a team that had built a reputation around actually getting things done, getting things done on time, and trying to help enable the business to do what we needed to do. But we wanted to improve our efficacy. We had issues where we'd miss steps, and that velocity would inevitably come back to bite us because we would miss things. And responding to the needs of the business is really important. Obviously, if you have a customer-facing security vulnerability or something that's broken and impacting how the customers are using your system, that can cause a problem. But then, your fix to that could also introduce a bunch of other risks that you may not be thinking about if you've just got like the one guy on call late at night. Trying to reduce the effects of our biases. So, ignoring red flags. Who here has been in a planning meeting and you see all the signs that it's going to go wrong, and you're not going to have a good time when it's time to actually implement it. Everyone's kind of quiet. They're all looking at each other, like, who's going to say that this is not a good idea? And dates is another good one. Who's seen a project manager lose their shit? Their eyes go dead. They kind of, they're trying to deal with the fact that their schedule's slipping. Their Gantt charts are all fucked now, and they've got to like rejigger the whole works. I mean, that's an important thing because we're all incentivized by something. Sysadmins are traditionally incentivized by uptime. Developers are incentivized by getting new features in front of users faster. Project managers are incentivized by dates. So everyone's trying to work towards their incentives, and that can affect how you perceive problems. So trying to reduce some of that. Providing more opportunities for peer review and more visibility. So making it more obvious how we manage things in operations, as well as providing more avenues for input. Programmatic change control has made this a lot better. It's a lot easier to do a code review of Puppet instead of a spreadsheet that you're trying to, like, oh yeah, I typed in all the commands again here, and it's not quite right because it changes machine to machine and that kind of stuff. So, and then making sure we're aligned with the contractual requirements that we have as a business. Our customers will require us to send a certain amount of notice in some cases, and other kinds of things like that we get held accountable for. So making sure that we're taking that stuff into account too, in addition to our own needs. And what don't we want? Who here has a change control board? How do you like it?
I don't have to deal with it directly, thankfully.
How well do you think it works?
I like to think that their change control board is name only. I think it may be a little bit of a legacy thing. I think they do a pretty good job.
Okay.
But I've been part of other organizations that have the traditional change control.
Yeah. It turns into theater and politicking. Like, oh hey, I know I can talk to so and so and they'll be able to get this through. We'll make it sound like it's not a big deal. We'll get it out. We'll get it done. Don't worry, it's cool. Really good article about this from Jez Humboldt about risk management theater. So good reference there. Process for the sake of process is another one that we're sensitive to. Some organizations, they have a big failure in how they did something, and then suddenly there's a new 30-page document from some guy who's never actually done anything about how to do your thing. And it's, like, okay, we'll skip that. And it doesn't get, not even the spirit of the thing gets followed because you're so put off by the idea of it in the first place. The Air Force action, that's the next one. And then documentation around that, in the same vein, documentation that no one can actually use because it's 30 pages long. So the Air Force, as an example, has a risk management document that's 31 pages long and talks about how to assess risk for, their airmen and other things like that. But it is a hard read. I actually went through and tried to read it before I had this talk put together, and I was like falling asleep. I was not going to make it through. So if you're into that, you might check it out, but could be an example of what not to do. Trying to avoid single points of failure. So we do this a lot in our infrastructure because we run active data centers, and we're really cognizant about our availability model. But we didn't want to introduce single points of failure in the human part of the organization. So, having one guy who's the ultimate sayer of what goes and what doesn't scale. Everyone goes on vacation, so we got to make sure that we're not like introducing a new single point of failure in a person or in a given role. And then a culture that we don't want a culture that punishes failure instead of using it as an opportunity to improve. It's a tough thing when you fuck up, and it's even tougher if you know that there's going to be a meeting where you get raked over the coals about it. So, encouraging folks to be able to say, yes, this happened. Obviously, it was wrong because we were down for an hour or whatever. It's often obvious, and often everyone knows why it happened, but using it as an opportunity to do better is really important. So how do we try and get there? And so what I tried to do here is kind of walk through what we ended up implementing for our change control process and kind of do a high-level overview of our thought process behind the methodology. So one of the biggest things that we want to do with this is use it as an opportunity to educate others on how to assess risk. So we're not trying to, like I had mentioned earlier, we're not trying to make a funnel for all this risk assessment to go through. We're trying to educate others on things to be cognizant of as they're doing their work, because everyone in our technology organization is working on stuff that inevitably makes it to production. And then in turn they have to be thinking about what's the bigger impact of what I'm working on and how might that add some risk. So some of the key considerations, the two key considerations about risk for us are business impact, whether it's financial, customer reputation, things like that, or whether it's complexity, number of moving parts, impacts, or impacts to the components being touched, or the components that touch those components. And it ended up looking something like this. So trying to dumb it down into something that is digestible and usable for folks without having to read a 31-page document. So it goes from lowest risk to highest risk. There's just 3 levels. There's not a score or an algorithm to compute the score. Trying to keep it simple. Obviously, if you have a single change to a low-risk system, if I'm updating, we'll get into that later. Sorry. So factors around business impact, change scope. If you're updating a version of Cassandra on a production Cassandra cluster, that's potentially a high-risk change if every transaction that comes in the front door has to use that data store to respond to the request. Whereas if you have, systems that are segregated from each other around a data center boundary or something like that, that can, change that conversation a lot because you have more isolation of your change and its impact. Sensitive times, for us, we have a lot of sensitivity around Cyber Monday, or Cyber Monday, Black Friday, Super Bowl, some other events like that generate a lot of traffic for us. So we want to be cognizant of other things that are going on in the world. Just remember a few years ago, there was a big sporting event in Europe, and we had no idea. We're like, wow, traffic is really high. I wonder what's going on. And we looked at, someone happened to notice in the news that there was this big event going on in Europe, and it drove a lot of traffic towards us. And then sensitive around production outages. So our SLAs get measured by third parties, and if we've already had a bad month, something went wrong, whether it's just internet wonkiness or other things, we want to make sure that we're sensitive about how that gets reported, since those reports go to our customers and we don't get to influence them. So we're definitely on the hook for those kinds of things. And then, has the change been tested or reviewed? If this is a change that we've done 100 times before and we've got it down to a science, it's a lot less risky than something that we're trying for the first time, because we're in that pinch and we need to figure out what's going on with the services. Then around complexity, similar things, change scope matters a lot here. If you have the potential to knock all of your customer transactions offline at once, pretty bad. If you're just changing a hard drive, that's pretty non-complex, something we have done a lot of times before. Automation helps drive complexity down because it's allowing you to express the things that are going on through code. If you've got a set of tested automation scripts that do the work and have been tested before they were run in production, that's a huge win from a complexity standpoint, because you're able to both do it and do it the same way over and over again. Lockstep upgrades are a thing that can make things really complex. So we have a service-oriented architecture that drives most of our real-time services. And occasionally we get in situations where two of those services will have to be upgraded in lockstep. And recently we actually had a situation where we upgraded it, found an issue, had to roll it back. Okay, not so bad. Fixed that issue, rolled it forward, had to roll it back again. And each of these deployments and rollbacks is across a dozen servers across 2 data centers, and it's manual orchestration at this point. So it's a lot of busy work, and it's stressful because you have to make sure you've got all those I's dotted and T's crossed, or else you could impact customer service. So in a real-time environment, that stuff gets really tedious. And as I mentioned, if you don't have a rollback process, you've got to fix forward. And what does that look like? If you made this change on a Friday and it's all messed up, is there anyone who can actually get engaged and fix this? Brand new tasks that we have, we assess as a group. So if this is something like a service that's brand new that we're implementing for the first time, we'll have a lot of meetings and talk about how we plan to roll this thing into production. How we plan to bring it online without impacting other services, if that matters, those kinds of things. So being thoughtful of that and looping people in from outside of the group that's been working on it for the last 6 months, because they've got that blinder on that says, I've got to get this thing out, I've got to get it done. They might not have been thinking about some of those things. And clearly defining success. Going back to that kind of change control board or example of that meeting where everyone's kind of glazed over, I mean, how often does that happen where you're like, when this is done, how will we know? Like, when will we know that we've succeeded? Some of these change sets can get really large and ambiguous. Like, how do we measure that the thing that we're doing is actually done and that it has succeeded? Calling out that there's a big difference between planned and unplanned work is also important. So, planned work is stuff that you've done a lot before. Unplanned work is that frantic troubleshooting at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out why, everything takes 2 seconds to respond. So, everything that is unplanned, that we don't have a kind of a recipe for, gets called out as like, this is automatically a step higher because you are kind of winging it. And that's kind of why we have the quality people that we do, because we want them to be able to respond in the moment, but it automatically becomes more risky because you're kind of winging it. So, kinds of changes. So, emergency changes have to be accounted for, because if you have to, adhere to a really tedious change control process where you've got to call for people before you can even log into production, that's not going to help you meet your SLAs. Making sure that you've broadly communicated that there's an emergency and that people need to be aware of it. Clearly communicating when the emergency is over is also important. Nothing like coming into the office the next day like, God, is this still a problem? Like, is that still fucked up in prod? Like, oh yeah, sorry, we fixed that at like 2. Oops.
Sore topic.
Yeah, God, no. Exactly. Making sure that you've documented that there was a problem, what the solution was, and that you've got a play-by-play. We use HipChat for this. We call it the deployment room. It's really kind of the production change room. Every deployment that we do, every big production change that we do gets called out play-by-play in that room. Like, hey, I'm deploying on this server now. And then someone from QA goes, okay. And then we go, hey, QA person, ready for you to test. Validate that this looks sane. And that also gives you timestamps, which is huge when it's like 2 days later or like the Monday after a weekend issue, and you're like, when did I change that config? And like, when did it get better? Go back to the graphs, go back to the HipChat room. Got a lot of more metadata around your stuff at that point. So high-risk changes. So when we're assessing one of these, we want to know, do we fix forward or roll back? They're both viable options. We just have to understand the pros and cons to each. I think in a lot of cases we prefer to fix forward, but it might be easier to roll back, and that's something that we talk about. Making sure that we have cross-team reviews. So we're pretty formal about this. Like recent, as I mentioned before, Cassandra upgrade that we did. We were really formal, went through a couple planning meetings with folks from development, QA, and the SRE team there to talk about the process end to end, to make sure everyone was on board and understood what was going on. We got approval from a director for that, so making sure both that they have a chance to see what's going on and say like, oh, that seems sane, as well as making sure that there's an awareness through the organization that there's a big change underway. That particular upgrade took weeks because of the data shuffling and stuff that has to go on. So there's a lot of moving pieces and parts that had to be accounted for. And it's something that people have to be cognizant of because not everything else in the environment stopped at that point. One of the things that we did to replace that ICL spreadsheet is we switched to using Trello for that. So if you're not familiar with Trello, it's basically a really free-form web application where you can build cards and add elements to cards. And the elements we like the most are the checkboxes. So we will have, in the Cassandra example again, we have a checkbox for each host and the set of operations that we need to do on that host in order. And then as someone makes those changes, they check off each box. So that way when you come back the next day, you're not confused about where you were in the process and what stuff is outstanding. It's especially good in situations where there's more than just one person making changes in the environment. Because it's real time. I check a box on my machine, you almost immediately see it on your machine. So it gives you a good real-time feedback view. We have a shared Google Calendar called the Deployment Calendar. Every production deployment gets an event on the calendar as an all-day event for that day. Other changes make it there too. A good example is our network folks use it a lot. Like, hey, we're changing the firewalls, be aware. Provides visibility both in technology and to our client services folks who can get calls and questions about what's going on. The Trello board, yeah, again, very detailed. Every step gets documented in there. We review it. We make sure that it's all there and that we're keeping it up to date as we go through the process. Communicating out to other groups in the high-risk change scenario, again, making sure that client services group knows what's going on, knows that there's things underway. A lot of times, it doesn't matter. It's just kind of extra noise. But there are some times when the change is a new API that we're adding or something like that, and then they need to know so they can be aware of how to communicate things to customers. Again, we do step-by-step announcements in chat as these changes occur. Even with the Trello board, we still want to call out those things. So we have a succinct timestamp and a map of what happened. With long deployments, we'll actually build a new chat room and say, hey, if you're curious about the status of this thing, come over to this room. It's all there. There's a history. When the work is done, we just archive the room. Then you can go back and search it later. And then a retrospective, so going through after the fact and making sure that we've covered anything that might need to improve, things that didn't go well, especially to make sure that we can learn from it for next time. So just making sure we close that loop. Even if things go well, we can often learn something from it. Like, oh yeah, if we thought about this, we could have eliminated half the man hours or something like that. So medium risk changes, similar set of things, just a little more limited, a little more free form because we don't want to slow everyone down. Again, fix forward or fix back or downgrade. We don't require a cross-team review here. You say, hey, if you peer review it with someone else on the team, that's reasonable. The medium risk, implies that you are not going to impact both of our data centers, for example, and cause a huge service outage. Approval is still required from me or other directors or the CTO. We have a decent approval chain, so it's not like it's just hung up on me waiting to say yes, this is reasonable. Other folks in the organization can say, yeah, this seems like it's a go. One of the things that we do is a control ticket 24 hours prior to the work beginning. So all of our software deployments are this way. We make sure that it's been in there for 24 hours, and that includes the documentation for the work that needs to be done. And this is an opportunity for us to check it out, review it, noodle on it for a while, let it percolate, because that last minute, okay, I've just finished the docs, let's roll it. It turns into pain sometimes. So we want to try and avoid that. And then a lot of the other stuff is the same. Step by step in HipChat, deployment calendar event. And then low risk is pretty freeform because we don't want to have a big slowdown. So we will do an inter-team review if it is a undocumented process. So if this is the first time you're doing a certain kind of firewall rule or the first time you're doing a certain kind of configuration change, we haven't toggled that flag before, have someone else peer review it, make sure that it seems like you've got your head screwed on straight. So here's a practical example. You've got a DNS record for a load balance pool, and you want to update it. That in itself is a pretty low risk task. You're just updating the IP address in the record, updating the DNS zones, serial code, and saving with change, reloading bind. That's easy. But because there are 3 customer-facing services that use that load balancing pool, you might want to make sure that you've got someone that is saying, yeah, you spelled SOAP correctly, or iovation correctly in our case a lot of the time. So in this case, it's a medium risk. It's not like a stop the world and build a Trello board for it, but we want to make sure that someone has had a chance to, sanity check things. And here's one that's a lockstep service upgrade. So high complexity because we're manually updating nodes. We're deploying, in some cases we're deploying that set of changes with Puppet, but in other cases we haven't built that tooling yet. So it's a manual upgrade of the package. It's a manual update to the configuration files and validating that all the configuration files still look like they did before we upgraded the service. Those kinds of things. Rollback is just as complex because you're just doing the same stuff in reverse with a different version. And it could be a big impact because it's customer facing, and that big thing customer of yours is calling it 5 times a second at least. So in this one it's a high. So we would be calling that out step by step in a Trello board, documenting it out as we go in HipChat. There's opportunities to automate some of that stuff too. We can build a HuBot bot for HipChat. I don't know if you guys have heard of HuBot. It's a JavaScript chatbot basically that can use any number of things as inputs. So you can build one that latches into the Trello API and drops a little HipChat note every time someone checks something. So that can be, that's ways you can improve this stuff. A lot of this is glue. So, yeah. So I went kind of fast, but I know it's the end of the day and you're all ready for more beer, so. Any questions? Thoughts, comments, anything?
And 2 comments. Great job. But 2 comments. I like the talk of the reviewing those high risks across teams. A lot of our organizations, we've got good people, good technical managers, good technical directors. They're where they are because a lot of them have done that job. They have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge. And sometimes we're resistant to bringing in other people to evaluate risk.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of insight into some things we haven't thought about.
Yeah.
And so that's good. And the second thing is the retrospective. Good, bad. We can't be in such a hurry to roll to the next thing that we don't take a moment to kind of reflect on lessons learned and document those.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just going to do the same thing again, probably, good or bad.
Yeah, and especially if it's a big successful one that you want to celebrate, schedule it at the end of the day and then go out to the bar afterwards and have a beer. It's a good opportunity to kind of put everybody in the same room. And then, if you have the opportunity to take them out to a beer and say, hey, we did a good job, we should celebrate that because, not every day goes well. So we want to make sure we celebrate the good ones when we get them. And on the cross-team thing, it goes back to the DevOps mindset. You want to make sure you're being inclusive of other teams. And for example, like our Puppet repo, anyone in technology can check that out and check it out, see what we're doing, how we do things. We do pull requests from people all over in technology all the time, and it's built that way on purpose. Metrics are the same way. We make sure that we expose all of our, graphite data and systems data and log data to everyone that can see it. Obviously PCI increases some of your sensitivity around some of that data, but if you can scrub it, why not show it to folks? Because, if you can let people self-serve that stuff, your ops teams are going to save a lot of time, like going and fetching logs and playing mailman, delivering logs to folks. So, anything else? Any horror stories of change control boards or project managers doing table flips or anything like that? Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it.